What's up everybody? Today we're going to be going over the LAB adjustments or lab adjustments in Rawtherapee. So to get to the lab adjustments, you just come over to your exposure tab and then you go all the way down to the bottom. And here you have this L asterisk A asterisk B asterisk adjustments. And this is commonly known as the lab adjustments. So I'm going to turn it on and obviously nothing happens because nothing has been changed in the lab adjustments. So let's go through what each of these things mean real quick, just so we know what we're going to be doing. So we have lightness, contrast, chromaticity. Lightness would be like exposure, contrast would be obviously contrast, difference between light and dark, and then chromaticity would be the amount of color in the image. Then we have this avoid color shift drop-down menu. And you can see there's some different selections here. This is generally used if you are changing color spaces. Leaving it on the Munsell only will be the default for almost 99% of situations. And then this restrict LC to red and skin tones. This little checkbox is going to become important in a bit. I'll explain it once we get there. And then of course we have the red and skin tones protection. And these two, this little checkbox and this slider, will become very apparent in a minute. Now we come down here, and if you're familiar with Rawtherapee, you know that these drop-down menus either lead to curves if there's a slash, or to point graphs if there's a line. I'm going to open up the L as standard, and you can see that we have a curve, or I'll open up the L-H, and you can see this point graph is similar to the HSV equalizer. Now, as I mentioned before, we have lightness, contrast, and chromaticity, but we also have the A and the B in the lab names. So the L stands again for lightness, the A stands for the green magenta color, and the B stands for the yellow blue color. What LAB essentially stands for is your exposure and your white balance. But having these adjustments all together gives incredible power. The L curve is very interesting because you can increase the brightness, but as you're increasing the brightness, you're not actually increasing the saturation overall. This is very different than if I was to come up to the exposure and increase the exposure. You can see how this and the yellow underneath the bird's face also increases. Contrast that back here with just increasing the lightness, and we are simply increasing the lightness in the image. Nothing else is being affected. So by separating out the lightness, the green magenta, and the yellow blue, we can get some pretty interesting effects. For instance, I can increase the lightness there, but then if I wanted to add in some interesting hues, you can see we can get some really interesting looks. This is maybe more of a muted color look. But then we also have the chromaticity, which we can just increase. That's like an overall saturation. And of course we can increase the contrast and lightness here as well. But again, if I reset all of these and I just increase the lightness here, it's the same as increasing it with the curves down here. Now there's a couple of things to point out. We have the LH point graph, which L, of course, we've established is lightness, H is hue, so we can affect certain hues. If I want to have only the yellow parts of the image be bright, and then I want to really darken the blue parts of the image, you can see that we can do that. Then we have the CH point graph, which is the chromaticity and hue point graph. So this would be where if we want the saturation of the blue to be very, very saturated, but the yellow to be very undersaturated, we can achieve that look. And then we have the hue graph. Let's say we want to shift this blue hue to something else. I can just grab the blues and move that up. And now you can see that the blue has shifted more towards purple. So then we come down to the CC, or the chromaticity versus chromaticity. And this is where we can add in more fine-tuned saturation. We can add in more saturation to colors that are already saturated, which is what I've done with this dot right here. Or we can add in a ton of saturation to the desaturated colors, and then keep the rest of the colors that already have the current saturation the way that they are. As you can see when I move this back and forth, since there's not a ton of saturation in this image to begin with, most of the image gets saturated. Next we have the lightness versus chromaticity, and this is where these two, this checkbox and this slider, come in handy. Let me switch over to an image that has skin tones in it. So I've switched over to this image. I've gone into the lightness and chromaticity curve, and I've unticked the restrict LC to red and skin tones. I've also zeroed out the red and skin tones protection, and you can see how saturated this skin tone mask is. If I go ahead and just tick this on, not a whole lot has changed. You can probably see that there is some change in the trees back here, but I can go ahead and increase this. And now all of a sudden we see that the skin tones here have lost a lot of the over vibrance that they had. You can kind of dial in what you want when you're using this particular curve. It's important because if you're editing portraits, it's very easy when you're playing with lightness to accidentally oversaturate your model, and then you give them orange or pink skin and they look like they have this giant sunburn rather than being very professional. This slider and this checkbox give the ability to fine-tune this tool. And then of course we have the chromaticity versus lightness, which is just the opposite of the lightness versus chromaticity. And so everywhere that is this light is receiving extra saturation, which is most of the image, because I pulled this dot over in the mid-tones range. So if you made it with me this far, let's go back to our bird image and let's go ahead and edit this thing. I'm gonna zero everything out. To zero it out, you have to open up each one of these and then hit this little back arrow. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna increase the lightness by about half just to start things out, and I'm gonna increase the contrast and chromaticity to give us a good starting spot. And I'm gonna increase the chromaticity a little bit more because I wanna bring out the color in these feathers. Now I'm gonna come to the lightness curve, and this is where dial in the overall look of this. I don't wanna blow out the highlights in the back. That's not gonna be good. I'm making sure that the top of this curve doesn't hit the top of our graph, otherwise we get kind of this more crunchy look, and I don't want to lose that color information. Now I'm going to come over to the chrominance and lightness graph. So I'm going to play with the curve here a little bit, maybe flatten it out. And of course you can switch back to linear if you want to see what was before. So this is before, and then this is after. So I think that looks pretty good. Now I want to deepen the blues of this parrot's back. So let's go over first to the chrominance versus hue. And for me, I like to get rid of all of these that I'm not using. So get rid of all those. And now I'm going to increase the blue here. But like I said, I want it to deepen as well. So I'm going to come over to here to the lightness and hue and get rid of these. And now we're going to decrease the lightness just for those hues. So this is before and this is after. And I think that looks pretty good. And the crazy thing is we did all of this editing from one single tool rather than using a bunch of different tools throughout Rawtherapee. There's pros and cons to both. If you want the ability to use something like vibrance plus saturation because you want to mix and match those, then you definitely need to use both of those specific sliders. But the lab adjustments are incredibly powerful because you can do so much from just within the lab adjustments window. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have made it this far in the video, I want to thank you for your time. If you have any comments, questions, or even suggestions for other tutorials, feel free to leave them in the comments section down below. If you like this content and you want to see more, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.